Hi everyone and welcome. Today we're joined again by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, the former advisor to the Secretary of Defense and also a writer on geopolitics and military strategy. So welcome back. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you, Glenn.
So after decades of these forever wars that continue to result in defeat after defeat, we see that some people argue that Trump instead achieved a great victory in only a 12-day war. You are not one of those people, I take it, as you argue that, well, this was not a success and also the war is not over. So you expect this to be a long war, if I'm not mistaken. What are your expectations?
Well, I wrote something where I tried to introduce the idea of the new long war because I don't see any immediate resolution, certainly none in sight. This is a different set of circumstances, though, from what Americans have experienced in the past. This is a wholly Israeli fabricated war. In other words, Israel and its supporters in the United States have fabricated this war with the goal of achieving Israeli supremacy in the region. But more important, I think you're talking about financial hegemony shared by the various billionaire oligarchs that dominate the city of London and New York City and now control Washington. And people are very concerned because this is not the Trump they knew 5-6 years ago, and it's not the Trump they thought they voted for. But they have to go back and rethink some of their assumptions. For those who actually watched the Republican convention, they could not have missed this event that had a giant Israeli flag on the wall, a huge sign that said Israel first, and then this gentleman, whom I do not know and have never seen before or since, walk out onto the stage and try to lead cheers for Israel first. I don't think people really understood what they were seeing, but it was a very clear demonstration of where we were headed as a country if Donald Trump were elected. And ultimately, Donald Trump could never have reached the White House had he not had the support of the Israel lobby's billionaires who were determined to get him into office. So now he's there and he's doing essentially what they want him to do. And that's where we are now. As far as the new long war is concerned, the reason I say that is that this 12-day conflict is not the end of anything. We've been down this road before. World War I did not really resolve anything. So you ended up with what people subsequently called a 20-year truce. And then the Second World War broke out, which was an extension of the first. Desert Storm ended in 1991 inconclusively because there was no willingness to either annihilate the Republican Guard Corps, which was largely allowed to escape, or to march on Baghdad and demand the replacement of Saddam Hussein. So we're in a similar situation now. The last 12 days did not resolve anything. If anything, it demonstrated that Iran's missile arsenal, as pointed out by Ben-Gvir, in Israel was far greater than anybody appreciated and far more accurate and devastating. And all you have to do is look at the map of targets that Larry Johnson published on his site. It's very clear that Israel was in a lot of trouble. And now we've had several people that have given us information suggesting that it was Israel that called President Trump and said, we need a pause. Can you help us with a ceasefire? It was certainly not Iran. And no one should be surprised by that. After all, Iran's a nation of 92 million. That's the size of Western Europe. So why would they be desperate at this point for a ceasefire? So I think we just don't know where we go from here, but I don't think it's anywhere good because the American people are not focused. And this is something most Europeans don't understand. Americans are not focused on foreign policy. They never have been, really. If you had put anything to a vote, Americans would not have fought in any of the wars beyond our borders. In fact, the only war that anybody was really excited about was the Mexican War in 1846, 47, 48. That's it. We weren't even very happy about the Civil War. The reason the Civil War lasted as long as it did was because the North didn't want to mobilize. People didn't want to fight the war. We didn't want to fight in World War I. Didn't want to fight in World War II. We were hoodwinked into these wars by presidents who were determined to drag us in. We went in, we fought, And as soon as they were over, we did everything we could to come home. And when the Cold War ended, we decided that's enough. And virtually everybody said, let's collect our military dividend. In other words, an end to this massive spending, come home and focus in the United States. And again, we developed arguments to go around that, to keep us engaged, on the assumption that keeping America engaged overseas was not necessarily important to us, but it was so important to the rest of the world that we be everywhere. And so we've been dealing with these various lobbies that have taken the position the world will not be safe until the United States occupies most of it. Well, that's insanity. But here we are with a different version of it. This time it's entirely Israel-focused, and it's designed to essentially establish this hegemony in the region, get control of all the oil resources. That's what the banks in the city of London and New York City want. That's what the billionaire oligarchs want. This morning I was listening to, I think it's Alex Kiner, and he mentioned what he called the money-lending oligarchs. I had not heard that one before, but that works just as well as billionaire oligarchs. But I think it's probably more descriptive of just who is behind everything. And then I listened to Oliver Stone, who was speaking, was talking about much the same thing. And this will continue until Americans are somehow or another involved and killed, to be blunt. As long as Americans aren't being killed, other people can die, other people can suffer. But until you kill Americans, nobody here in the United States pays a great deal of attention. And I think that's what people in the White House and on the Hill know. However, there's a huge problem, and that is that we are on very shaky financial ground. And you had the Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Besant, worried about the bond market. You had Jerome Powell under pressure to cut interest rates from the president. And you have a general feeling in the United States of unease. How can we spend on the scale that we're spending anymore when most people know instinctively you can't do that? But there is no will, no resolve to cut spending, no courage. And if you can't cut spending, you can't reduce your debt indebtedness. You can't reduce the so-called deficit, but you can't even make a dent in the sovereign national debt. So all of these things are somehow or another converging. I don't know what happens, but I don't think it's anything good.
No, I think many people who have some nostalgia for the Cold War, they neglect, there's some conditions are very different. That is, the economic prowess isn't there, the social cohesion, political stability, even moral compass, and of course the US dollar. I'm not sure how long it can hold on in the next economic crisis. It could be very easy that the dollar itself becomes the main source of crisis.
Well, I listened recently to someone who insisted that the yen and the pound and the euro would all go down before the dollar does. I don't know what the rationale for that is, but that was what many people are saying. In other words, we're the healthiest horse in the glue factory. I think that's what people call us. I think it's misleading. It's delusional. And I think you're right. I think the dollar is in a lot of trouble. It's no longer seen as a real store of value. In fact, I think it was Nassim Taleb who said today gold is effectively the reserve currency.
Yeah, I also heard the expression the cleanest shirt in the hamper. So they're all dirty, but this is the best one. So where does it go from here? Because I'm pretty much on the same page that I don't think this war is over. If anything, it's been already a very long conflict. Again, Israel has been threatening or warning about Iran for a few decades now, and but the war obviously didn't go as planned. So what would happen next? Is it the U.S. and Israel would begin to replenish and prepare new missiles, new weapons for continuation, bit like the Minsk agreement, I guess, just give a bit of a pause before having another go? Or will it be more pressure coming in as Trump's argument that all trace of the nuclear program has been obliterated, and when this is countered, he's pulled back into this. How do you see this war continuing, or is it just that the ceasefire will break down fairly soon?
Well, no one knows about the timing. That there are many, many factors that will influence the timing. If things were to remain constant overall, then I would say it would be 90 to 120 days before you would see a resumption, because it will take that long to restore Israel's missile arsenal. It would take that long for us to refit and rebuild our arsenal. Remember, we fired hundreds of missiles from offshore destroyers, Aegis-class destroyers, to try and help protect Israel. However, we're beginning to see something else happen in the region, and this is not necessarily brand new, but I think it's important that we understand that the CIA, MI6, Mossad, working closely together as they did in Syria, are also working in places like Egypt as well as in Azerbaijan and the Caucasus, and they're trying to isolate, to the extent that they are able, Iran from Russia. Now, they know they can't completely isolate Iran from China, although that may be possible in the future, but they definitely want to break that tie to Russia. Russia is a lifeline for Iran, and frankly, Iran is kind of a lifeline for Russia. Remember, Iran is the soft underbelly of Central Asia and the Caucasus that Russia depends upon for stability. And the worst thing that could happen would be for Iran to somehow or another disintegrate. Yet that's exactly what the CIA, MI6, and Mossad want to do. That's what they've been trying to do inside Iran by operating there and assassinating people. They've been trying to cause Iran internally to collapse. Now, that failed miserably, and if anything, I would argue that the last 12-day conflict has probably strengthened the Iranian regime more so than anything else. In fact, I was listening to several people who are experts on Iran, I am not, essentially make that argument and also point to the fact that the Iranian military, which has taken a backseat to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, is now very much involved and very much in the forefront of defending the country. That's very important, because if you can bring down a state, if you can somehow or another separate it from its army, especially, that's not happened. So I think we have to look at some recent developments. The Azerbaijan has an interest in gaining at least parts or portions of Armenia. It may at some point want to capture all of it. There's no love lost between the Turks and the Armenians, as we all know, and the Azeri Turks and Azerbaijan are no exception. What's interesting about Azerbaijan is its close alliance, for all intents and purposes, with Israel. Azerbaijan provided a platform for the Mossad and the Israeli armed forces to attack Iran. They are now turning into what is increasingly a state that is hostile to Moscow. And their ambassador in Moscow has been talking to the Russian authorities about some actions they've taken recently. I think the Russians are now cognizant of what's happening, and they're very concerned about it. The next step is, of course, for the Azeri army in Azerbaijan to move into northern Iran. Like Israel that wants a greater Israel, Azerbaijan wants a greater Azerbaijan. That means it's the most logical route for expansion is into northern Iran, where you have a very large Azeri population, maybe 25% or more of the population of Iran. Now, these Azeris are Shia, as opposed to Sunni, and you have a Sunni-Shia mix in Azerbaijan. They do still speak their language, but they have been a very important component of Persian civilization and of the Iranian state. But there have always been voices advocating for some sort of greater Turkish power in northern Iran. We'll see what happens, but I think the aim now on the Azerbaijan side is to move towards Tabriz, which is the center of gravity for the Azeri Turks. And this, of course, is music to the ears of Washington and in Israel, because this would contribute to their dream, which is to divide and conquer Iran. Now, whether or not that's possible, I can't judge, but I don't think we should underestimate the impact. It will certainly weaken Iran if this happens. It will divert Iranian resources. It will distract them from other things, which is ultimately a partially positive goal. If it contributes to the breakup of Iran, so much the better. And I think what we're seeing is the kind of strategy applied to Iran that has been applied to Russia. Ukraine was utilized, much as now there's a desire to use Azerbaijan against Iran to somehow or another break up Russia, to remove the government, then move into, and of course this is very important to the financial interests in London and New York City, to move in and strip Russia of its resources, its capacity, divide it up into smaller states, and then effectively rule it. That's failed. That gambit is over. But the gambit now is just beginning with Azerbaijan and Iran. At the same time, remember, if you look at this greater Israel map, and a lot of people look at it and say, well, this is fanciful. This could not possibly happen. There are only a few million Jews. Well, you have another problem, and that is the United States and its armed forces. And you have a general in CENTCOM who is reportedly, in the news at least, closer to Mr. Netanyahu than he is to President Trump. And in fact, the White House tends to turn directly to CENTCOM for its quote-unquote intelligence, which means that they're getting the Israeli perspective and slant. Now, that may not be a big issue because you've got a chairman of the Joint Chiefs who is the senior military advisor to President Trump, who is also a very powerful, strong advocate for Israeli interests. When he was retired, he was on the board of a hedge fund that was run by Jared Kushner's brother. So as you begin to look at the ties and the people who are involved in all of this, there's an opportunity here for the U.S. Armed Forces to become involved on the ground as well as in the air and at sea directly with the Israelis. And that then takes you to Egypt, because one of the goals the Israelis have had for a very long time is to recapture the Sinai and ultimately control the Suez Canal. I mean, there's something there worth having, and it's something they think they deserve. In 1956, they moved very rapidly through Sinai towards the Suez Canal with the French and the British in the hopes of securing control of it. It didn't work. Eisenhower said, get the hell out, and ended it. Today, that's not going to happen. Today, if anything, we will back it. Now, what the level of joint planning is, what the level of joint discussions happens to be, I have no idea. These are just things floating in the ether around Washington, D.C., and down in Florida around U.S. Central Command headquarters, and as always around Langley. So we'll have to see. But it doesn't look good, and it certainly bodes ill for any short war. The question is then not if we're going to see more war and see more American involvement, but when.
It doesn't seem like engaging in these larger wars, be it against now Russia or Iran, and trying to pull in actors such as Azerbaijan. It doesn't seem to be based on any unique, I guess, historical opportunities or current relative strength. It more seems to derive from desperation, though, a weakening position and hoping to, I guess, turn things around. But you earlier used the word hoodwinked, that the Americans had throughout history been hoodwinked into wars which they didn't really support. But how did Trump get pulled into this? Assuming that, he was genuine in his former statements that he wanted, again, to end the Ukraine war. He wanted to, I do believe that one, but also they didn't want to get pulled into any Middle Eastern wars because, I was a bit surprised that he let himself be used by Netanyahu in this matter.
Well, first of all, keep in mind that President Trump owes his position in the White House right now to the same billionaire oligarchs that fund the Israel lobby, and also some who are equally involved in the defense business, in other words, the so-called military-industrial complex. You can't ignore, or you can try, but it's difficult to ignore the people that paid for your success. So I think President Trump is certainly in trouble in that sense, and that's not something that's easy for him to do. The second thing is that we hear all the time about the Epstein files, and the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, announced that she had them and then said she couldn't possibly release them. And when she was asked why not, she said, well, it will cause a greater anti-Semitism. in the United States if I release these files. Well, you can imagine that that has piqued everybody's interest. Not that it was a big surprise, given Epstein's background and his connection, obviously, to the Mossad and others and the CIA. But bottom line is, we don't know what is in those files. We don't know who is in those files. And remember that this includes a lot of videotape that may still exist, may not. I don't know. But this was a pretty horrific operation that ran the so-called Lolita Express. Everybody's trying to figure out, what does it mean? And does this mean anything in the White House now? Then you have to look at the people in the White House that dominate the discussions, that frame the briefings and presentations. These are people who are unabashed, unapologetic Israeli nationalist supporters. In other words, these are not people who are lukewarm about what's happening. They are avid supporters. And against this, you must, or behind this, you must also understand that certainly since the 1990s, you've had a lot of prominent neocons like Richard Pearl and Wolfowitz and others who are advocates for gaining control of the Middle East's oil and gas fields. Now, their rationale for that at the time was, if we control all of this, we have China by the throat. This is in the 1990s, where people were beginning to see China as a potential peer competitor, and we're thinking, well, how do we hold them in check, on the assumption that China is some sort of aggressive power bent on conquering the world, which is a lot of nonsense. I don't sign on for that at all, but nevertheless, that was the thinking. So if you think that's important, and you think that this is a way to curb or contain or restrain China, controlling the flow of oil is very important now. The Chinese aren't stupid, and they realized for a very long time that we were going to essentially move down this road. So what did they do? They started building this One Belt, One Road, essentially a restoration not just of the Silk Road, but also the expansion of a commerce system on land across Eurasia, across Eurasian landmass. We just saw the train arrive in Tehran from China on the rail links. The Russians are very keen on building the rail lines and roads and transportation nets all the way down to the Indian Ocean through Iran, back up into Russia, Ukraine, and all the way to Europe. There's two ways to view all of this as an American. You can say, well, this is interesting. How do we plug into this? How do we as Americans, we're a maritime power. Perhaps we should build fleets of fast ships that can pick up material on the Eurasian periphery, transport it to the Atlantic coast, put it on our own fast rail, move it all the way to the Pacific, and then again on fast ships and move it across the Pacific. In other words, is there a way for us to fit in with this? Because we have a huge advantage, at least we have up until this point: one language, one law, one people from the Atlantic to the Pacific, whereas the Chinese, as they build out this One Belt, One Road, are dealing with a multiplicity of peoples and languages and laws, and everybody, of course, along the route has their hands out. We don't have that problem in the United States, so we should see ourselves as enjoying something of a competitive advantage. But I haven't seen any interest in that. I've tried to promote that idea myself to no avail. Instead, I see a lot of interest on finding ways to sabotage, destroy, and undermine this One Belt, One Road and the development of this commercial infrastructure. Hence, you're back to where we started. Grab control of the Middle Eastern oil and gas fields. Why not just do it and forget Iran? Well, Iran is probably the second, may even be the first, with the largest reserves. Iran is the biggest player, and Iran has refused to submit. And if you will not submit to Israeli hegemony over the region, you are the enemy, because by definition, that hegemony extends to us and to the banking interests that I've talked about in London and New York City.
Well, if the fighting now, for all of these reasons, would be revived, grabbing the oil, disrupting some of the connectivity between Iran, the Russians, and the Chinese, how would the U.S. and Israel be able to do it different? Because what will be your lessons, I guess, from the war that just finished? Because it appears to many that Iran came out as a winner in terms of it was much stronger than people expected. Israel came out being looking much weaker than countries existed, which is a very dangerous thing for Israel, uh, given that it's a small country in that region. So it needs to have I guess, a sufficient deterrent. So it kind of enjoyed this position where everyone feared the Iron Dome, and if anyone tried to go against Israel, they would be demolished. So, so how are they able to turn things around with Iran? Is it possible to simply do the same thing over again with more missiles? Because yeah, you mentioned Larry Johnson and his assessment of what was destroyed in Israel. It appears that a lot of the industrial capacity and yeah, the military was hit quite bad as well. So it's they're not going to be able to get back at the fighting power they had before. But do you have any assessment on Iran versus Israel there? If they will be more prepared, in terms of this connection you just spoke about with Russia, China, do they have? Are they supplying the Iranians now, or refurnishing, or uh, rebuilding their missile capabilities? I'm just wondering how the next round of the war would look like.
Well, the Russians and the Chinese are engaged in kind of burden sharing arrangement with Iran. In other words, both are supporting Iran. They're supporting Iran in different ways. In other words, each is supplying different things, different capabilities. The Chinese just announced they're shipping, I guess, or it may have already arrived, I don't know, 40 new fighter jets. These are the newest fourth generation fighters that China has, and supposedly they'll eventually reach a total of 127. Now, just because they show up doesn't mean that the fighters will all be extremely effective. I mean, you've got to train people, you have to maintain it, but I'm sure the Chinese will provide lots of support in that connection. The Russians, on the other hand, are very involved on the integrated air defense side and also with the missiles, although Iran's own indigenous missile production capability and technology is excellent. I think you have to look at what's happening on the periphery. We talked about Azerbaijan. You also have to look at the Turks and Syria. And Syria is an interesting phenomenon because now we have a former deputy head of Al-Qaeda and ISIS running the country. And everybody is very happy with this, whether they're in Saudi Arabia, Washington, or Israel. It's kind of, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. They're murdering Christians left and right. But then again, the Israelis just destroyed a village in the West Bank that was entirely Christian, burned all the homes down, and are driving the people out. So it doesn't make any difference to them. But Erdogan has something else on his agenda that's a little different. He is concerned about the emergence of a Kurdish state. And we and the Israelis have supported that. The Israelis take the position that if you're my enemy's enemy, you must be my friend. And so the Mossad has been active with the Kurds for many years, helping them. It may be that we and the Israelis are now willing to sell out the Kurds in order for Erdogan to realize his vision of crushing any emerging state that could be Kurdish in the region, that is both in Syria and northern Iraq. That's a problem because we also support the MEK, which is a Turkish, some people call it a terrorist organization. Others say they're just Kurds, nationalists that want to overthrow the regime in Tehran. And anybody who talks about overthrowing the regime in Tehran is automatically welcomed in Washington, even though these people were backed by Saddam Hussein that we went to such trouble to remove. But then we kept them in place for future use against Iran. I guess what I'm saying, there are a lot of moving parts here. And when I wrote this piece on the new long war, my purpose was trying to get people to understand that this may sound promising if you're the CENTCOM commander and you think this is your path to greatness as a general by helping to orchestrate all these moving parts. You may think this is wonderful if you're in Tel Aviv, that this is a way to bring down your chief adversary and finally create the Pacific region under your control that you want. But there's a problem with this sort of thing, and that's what I tried to point out at the end, that you can't really control these things. Diplomacy is usually the preferred outcome because even though you may not get everything you want, you can get something that may be durable and you can build upon that and you avoid a war. Wars are always gambles. And unfortunately, everyone in Washington seems to be committed to gambling as opposed to diplomacy. And I try to tell people that in 1941, one of the last people who was brought in to brief Adolf Hitler on the final plan for Barbarossa was a German general named Ernst Köstring. Ernst Köstring had been born in Moscow. His family had lived there. They were Germans, of course, and Prussians, but they'd lived there since the reign of Catherine the Great. So he was very fluent in Russian, knew the Russians very well. During the First World War, he went back to Imperial Germany in order to serve in a Prussian cavalry regiment, as his family had. But he's someone who was always very pro-Russian. And of course, like many Germans, once that war ended, one of the things they said was, that was a terrible mistake. We and the Russians should never have fought. So he was very uncomfortable with everything about Barbarossa. And he was then brought in after the final plan that had been developed by Paulus, who was captured at Stalingrad. It was a catastrophe. After that plan had been altered and its assumptions changed to make it palatable to Hitler, he was brought in and he said, General, you are the Russian expert on the general staff. How do you think the people in the Soviet Union will respond as we advance into the Soviet Union? He said, well, all the people on the periphery are non-Russians. Most of them don't like the Russians, and they will probably welcome the Germans. So your advance to the borders of Russia will probably be quite rapid. But once you reach Russia, the Russians will fight ferociously. They will defend every square meter, and the war will slow down and become very, very dangerous. Well, of course, Hitler didn't agree with him because the Russians had performed so badly in 1939 against the Finns, and so he said, thank you very much. He was polite, but that was the end of it. Well, of course, we know Köstring was right. We've seen that again in Ukraine with the Russians, and I think we're making similarly false assumptions about any future conflict with Iran, utilizing the Turks as potential agents of destruction against Iran, or as potential agents of destruction against anybody we don't like in the region or that Israel doesn't like. And we're assuming that relations between Israel and Turkey, as long as Mr. Erdogan is there, will be wonderful. And we're ignoring Egypt, which is the largest Arab state, major power. And I think that's a serious mistake because although Mr. Sisi has been, in the eyes of his own people, a good puppet for Washington and Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, now he's very unpopular. There are millions of Egyptians that don't understand why their government, as well as other Arab governments, have done nothing about Gaza. And that brings us to the final issue here. People continue to die in great numbers in Gaza. The rest of the world is very sensitive to this, especially the Muslim world. We are hated for our support for Israel for helping them kill these people, either through starvation or bombing or whatever. But most Americans see very little of Gaza. People in Western Europe see very little of Gaza. We lose sight of the fact that's not true for the rest of the world. And that is a permanent catalyst for conflict. And we're doing nothing to fix that or to help that or to deal with it. Now, President Trump from time to time says, well, I'd like to see that end and I want to help these people. But President Trump says a lot of things. But in the final analysis, what happens? Not much. And again, to go back to the beginning, look at our financial condition. Look at our spending position. How much can all of this go on? And for how long? Until something breaks.
Yeah, well, I had the impression as well, though, that if there will be another round against the Iranians, that it would be seen as more preferable to also use proxy, if not Azerbaijan or, Syria, of course, with Jalani in power, would be possible. And, it could be successful if it exhausts the Iranians. I mean, on one hand, the war now, it did take its toll in terms of its hitting a lot of its military equipment and soldiers, but also the economic damages could be severe in the longer term. But people often neglect that the war also brought Iran closer. That is the cohesion, more support now for the government. So these dreams of regime change and splitting the country, I think this failed. Um, but as you said, there's many variables you have to take into account. If you pull in all these other actors now, already the Russians, Chinese are starting to get invested into this struggle. You mentioned the different Arab countries and Turkey that would possibly be pulled in, and the United States, unlimited resources also isn't um, that reliable anymore. As I said, if the economy begins to shake, and it does appear that it's already in trouble, seems like a massive gamble to engage in this. It's just, did you see this possibly laying I guess the grounds for was something that could look like a world war, or would Trump and other, I guess, great powers at least be cautious here?
President Trump is someone who absolutely does not want a war. I mean, that was very clear to me when I was working with him. I thought very highly of him for that reason. I still think he feels that way. Just look at how he tried to handle these strikes on Iran. First of all, we call them, tell them we're coming. They don't shoot at us. We bomb these sites that are ostensibly empty. We don't know, but you and I can't possibly know with certainty, but it certainly looks like there wasn't much there. There certainly isn't the radiation that everybody expected to find. And then at the same time, I think he wanted to put an end to what he thought was the war. How can he do that? Well, he can declare victory and say, well, this is over now. There's no more danger of any nuclear capability. It's gone. But we know that's not really true. And if you're an Iranian and you have all of these nuclear materials and you have them in other sites, your probable lesson at this stage is to build a nuclear weapon if you want to survive. Because the lesson is, if you give up your nuclear weapons, you end up like Libya and Gaddafi in Libya. I don't think anybody's rushing to get in line for that outcome. So, we can't see perfectly into the future. We don't know which comes first. Does our financial crisis here stricken us before we get a chance to extend this madness even further? We have a lot of people in Washington that absolutely cannot leave the rest of the world alone. The other thing is, we didn't mention Iraq. Iraq is firmly in the Iranian camp, and Iraq does multiply. It's a force multiplier for Iran. We shouldn't lose sight of that. They have aspirations. I don't know what those are. Someone told me that they feel strongly that Kuwait is really their territory and they should control it. There are a lot of moving parts here, and I don't see how you control all of them. The other thing is, we assume that these Emirates and Saudi Arabia, for that matter, are all solid, rock solid places. Well, I suppose as long as everybody has lots to eat, they don't have to work very hard, and everything's paid for, they'll survive. But any interruption in that could spell the end of those sort of fictitious places. I say fictitious because if you go to the Persian Gulf and you visit them, you rapidly discover they're what I would call 10-kilometer countries. You go 10 kilometers into the desert, and what's out there? Nothing. So I think we're on the threshold, whether we like it or not, of profound change. And that's always difficult to accept in the West. People always want to believe that the way things are will go on forever. Trying to tell them that forever is almost over and that we are all in for profound change is not well received. I think we're in for a lot of trouble here in the United States. We are not the nation of 1990 or 91 at all. And that needs to be borne in mind, because that speaks to this thing that we call societal cohesion. Russia has turned out to be very cohesive, much more so than everyone anticipated. How cohesive are we? It hasn't really been tested. We'll see. And how cohesive is Iran? Well, thus far, it's gone reasonably well. I think the Azerbaijani intervention will tell us something more. We'll see. But then again, back to Russia. What will Russia tolerate? This is the Caucasus. This is right on the border. This is important to them, what happens there. They don't want to see Iran fragment and become chaotic and anarchic. That's the last thing they want.
And this is a human condition, I think the assumption that, about the permanent state of the temporary world, but not current world. But no, we have the same in Europe. It's changing rapidly, but people, they still believe it's as if it's the 1990s. So, but Colonel Macgregor, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate your perspective on this, and I would advise anyone to read your article as well on the new long war. So thanks again.
On X. Yeah. Thank you, Glenn. Bye-bye.